All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Bug of the Week. My name is Bradon, and if you're new here, definitely leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. On this episode of our journey through all of the insect orders, we have arrived at Orthoptera, also known as the grasshoppers, crickets, and katydids. A quick shameless plug. I host a podcast, and you guessed it, we talk about bugs, and it's super fun. So if you haven't checked that out already, go check it out anywhere that you enjoy your podcasts. It's free, and it's a really good time. I chat with entomologists from all over the world, people who study insects as a career, and it's a really fun time. I've learned so much about that, and we have about 119, 120 episodes out for you to enjoy. I've been doing this for a couple years, and it's super fun, super good time, and I think you'll learn a lot. So go check it out. I'll leave a link in the description as always. But yeah, just wanted to let you guys know about that before we get started, because I know there are a lot of new faces. But with that, let's just jump right into it. Okay, so on our journey through the insect orders, we have arrived at one of the more iconic, interesting, and unique orders known as Orthoptera. So, first of all, Orthoptera in Greek, ortho meaning straight and ptera meaning wing. So, this is referring to the very unique hind legs of orthopterans. This order is abundant throughout the entire world. About 23,000 species have been described worldwide, which makes it definitely our most abundant order that we've been through so far. And this order has immense diversity. I mean, crazy shapes, sizes, adaptations, structures, colors, behaviors. Orthoptera is super cool, super flashy, and we have a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. So, like I said just a second ago, Orthoptera is characteristic of grasshoppers, katydids, and crickets. So how are those divided? How do you tell them apart? And what are some key similarities between all of them? First of all, let's go over some of the things that are universal across the entire order. And that would be, there's just a couple things. And it's filiform antennae. Their antennae are usually pretty long, and they're always thread-like, filiform. Next, and I would say the most iconic feature of the Orthoptera, would be the hind legs. These hind legs are what we call saltatorial, meaning they are modified for jumping. So they're very large at the base and very strong. If you've ever held a grasshopper or anything like that, and you feel it jump away, you feel how strong those legs are. And some orthopterans can jump many feet up in the air. They're very efficient. It's definitely one of the unique unifying features of the Orthoptera. Additionally, all of the members of this order have leather-like thickened tegmina, which I talked about in the last episode if you missed that one. Tegmina are when the first set of wings, the four wings, are modified into a leathery structure that aren't necessarily used for flying, more so for protection of the hind wings. This is not unique to Orthoptera, but it's applicable to Orthoptera. Are these little structures on their legs called tympanal organs, also known as tympanum. And the cool thing about these is that they're actually on their front legs. And so these little holes in their front legs are basically the ears of orthopterans. And if you think about it, them being on their legs makes a lot of sense, because us humans, we have necks, right? So we're able to move our head independently from our body to pick up certain sounds, right? Well, insects don't have necks like this, so they're not able to articulate their heads like this. And so having the tympanal organs on their front legs makes a lot more sense, because they're able to move them in response to hearing a sound. Another final unifying feature of this order is the chewing, biting mouth parts. So whenever you find an orthopteran, it will always have strong chewing mandibles. Now, they're all used for a variety of different things, but they're all going to be chewing, biting. This order also exhibits hemimetabolous development, like we've talked about throughout this series. They have a 3-stage incomplete metamorphosis going from egg to nymph to adult. I'm not going to go over this too much. We've all memorized this by heart by now, but yeah, the juveniles of this species basically look the same as the adults, they just don't have wings. So if you find a winged orthopteran, you know it's an adult. All right, now jumping into the different groups and families within the Orthoptera: grasshoppers, katydids, and crickets. So I'm actually going to start with grasshoppers because that's probably the most iconic, familiar group that you all are used to. So grasshoppers typically have shorter antennae. So they're still filiform, but they're not quite as long as in some of the other groups. So if they have shorter antennae, and then with the wings are often sort of tent shaped, so a triangular slope shaped, and the grasshopper as a whole is pretty skinny, pretty flattened along the dorsal side. I would say the most unique feature of the grasshoppers is their head shape. So if you look at it front on, it's definitely an oval shape, and their eyes take up a large portion of their heads. So grasshoppers are, across the board, all going to be herbivores. They're also huge pests, and they consume a lot of agricultural crops. They can wipe out entire fields very quickly, and so they are a focus of a lot of pest control research. And something that's especially harmful about them is not only the quantity that they eat, but also that they're hemimetabolists, right? So they eat a lot throughout the lifetime of one grasshopper. And so, they eat all the way through all of their nymphal instars, all the way into their adult instar. Then when they become an adult, they have the ability to fly and disperse to other fields, eat more, reproduce, and start it all over again. So within the group of grasshoppers, there are two families: Acrididae, which are the short-horned grasshoppers and locusts, and the Tetragidae, which are the pygmy grasshoppers. So that's a question I get pretty often, is like, what about locusts? Well, locusts are actually a kind of grasshopper, but they have larger wings typically, and they have a migratory behavior. So that's what makes locusts interesting, is because there's not really much different about their biology, but they have an interesting migratory and swarming behavior that most other grasshoppers don't have. So you'll see this mostly in African countries where an entire crop field or a savanna plain will be just wiped out by locusts and massive swarms of millions of them. And so this is an interesting example of group congregation and organized migration that applies to many different insects. And something interesting about this is we're not really sure what ecological or environmental cues will trigger a swarming event like this, and it's kind of a cyclical pattern. And so it doesn't happen every year usually. It's usually every couple years, and that's what's kind of interesting about these mass insect emergences, like the mayflies that we talked about earlier, or the cicadas that we'll talk about further down the line, is we're not really positive about what ecological factors will cause an event like this, which is very interesting because this is such a prevalent thing. They even talk about locust swarms in the Bible. It's been happening for a very, very long time. So it's interesting to think about that we don't even know what causes this or fully understand what the purpose of it is. Let's move on to katydids. Katydids are very cool. They're only within one family called Tetragonidae, and katydids are very unique. Most of them have very camouflaged appearances. So they're usually kind of cryptic, disguised as leaves, and some of them are very, very good at this. If you saw a katydid in a bush, you probably wouldn't even see the katydid because that's how good it is. The veins of the leaf are mimicked in the wings of the katydids. And this kind of goes across the Orthopteran order, is they're very good at camouflage. So on the polar opposite side, there's another thing called aposematic coloration, meaning they use very bright colors, reds, yellows, things like that, to warn predators that, hey, I either don't taste good or I'm poisonous or something like that. And that's called aposematic coloration. And so orthopterans will exhibit both of these behaviors. Some of them are very cryptic, and some of them have very bright warning colors. And so it's very cool to see the diversity across this order. And I would say katydids definitely lean towards the more cryptic side. Some of them are very, very convincing. So I would say most katydids are herbivorous, although there are some predatory katydids as well as omnivorous katydids. So they'll eat basically anything. but for the most part, they just feed on plant material. And then also, like some grasshoppers, many katydids are also pests as well. So something that I would tell katydids and grasshoppers apart by are katydids have much longer antennae. So if you ever find a katydid, it'll typically have very, very long thread-like antennae, sometimes even longer than the body itself. And that is because a lot of katydids are nocturnal, and so they use these antennae almost as, you know, a sensory feeling around in the dark. And so, yeah, because of this, you will often see a lot of katydids at night, and they'll also have very small compound eyes. So like I said with grasshoppers, they have very large compound eyes. With the katydids, if they have the long antennae, they will typically have very small bead-like eyes, and they're also typically on the ends of the head, so, you know, far apart from each other. So typically, if you find a katydid, it'll have long antennae, far apart, small eyes, and another cool thing about katydids is the females typically will have a very long blade-like ovipositor, which is on the end of the abdomen. It'll look like a little spike coming off the end of the abdomen. Sometimes it looks kind of like a scimitar or a scythe or maybe just like a big thorn coming out the end of their abdomen. And this is what they use to lay their eggs. So a female will typically stab this into the dirt or into a log or maybe like into a crevice of a tree and lay her eggs. And this ensures that the eggs are safe from predators. And so she then leaves, you know, never comes back, but this is a really easy form of better ensuring that your offspring will survive, at least to hatching. And so, yeah, if you ever find a katydid and she has a long appendage coming off the end of her abdomen, that's her ovipositor, and you know it's going to be a female. So, yeah, that's kind of a fun fact. Lastly, the crickets. So, crickets have 3 different families called Grylidae, which is true crickets, Rhaphidophoridae, which is the Campbell crickets, and the Gryllothalpidae, which is the mole crickets. So some distinguishing factors about crickets is, I would say one of the main things is the positioning of their legs. So they still do have those saltatorial legs, but the hind saltatorial legs typically are more flattened. They're more outspread away from the body instead of up and down, if that makes sense. So that's one distinguishing feature. And also, I would say crickets typically walk a lot more than they do jump. So with katydids and grasshoppers, they typically jump upwards, where a lot of crickets will walk and then kind of jump forward. They don't jump vertically quite as much. Also, crickets don't rely quite as much on their wings, and so their wings are a lot more reduced. So the wings of a cricket will typically be either almost non-existent, super reduced, or I would say most of the time with crickets, their wings do not extend beyond their abdomen. So with most grasshoppers and katydids, their wings will often extend beyond the abdomen, but with crickets, they almost never extend beyond the abdomen. Also, crickets oftentimes have those long thread-like antennae like the katydids, but then they also have the large compound eyes of the grasshoppers. So most crickets are actually nocturnal, so they'll have those long antennae. You'll usually find them only at night, and crickets basically do everything. So they will be herbivorous, some of them are carnivorous, but it's pretty rare, and lots of them are omnivorous, so they'll eat just about anything. Crickets also do have ovipositors, although they aren't quite as huge and crazy as some of the katydids are. Some of the cool camel crickets are really gnarly looking. They kind of have like a humpbacked appearance with these super long antennae because they are cave dwellers. And I would say crickets have some crazy adaptations. Some of them, like this tree weta, are super huge. And this one, called the Jerusalem cricket, is this huge cricket, and they can weigh as much as a mouse. They are absolutely enormous. And they actually do this really cool thing called drumming, where the males will like tap their abdomens on the ground, and the females will pick up the substrate-borne vibrations, and she'll drum back to let him know that she's interested. There's also this one called the tree weta, and these ones are cool because the males will actually have like a territory, and so they're like super territorial, and they will have a little house basically in a tree, and that's super valuable to the females. And so he'll basically like collect a harem of females and keep them in the tree cavity, and he'll like protect the entrance against other males, and he'll like, and then that's like his group of females that he gets to mate with. So it's a super cool, like, it's like a super cool, interesting territorial behavior that those ones have. But I would say the most, quintessential aspect of crickets is their vibroacoustic communication. So this is true for most of Orthoptera. So specifically crickets and katydids. I don't think grasshoppers do this quite as much, but certainly crickets and katydids do that, iconic call that you hear all the time. So yeah, that's probably the most, iconic, noticeable factor about Orthoptera is their call. And something cool about this is their call is actually species specific, which kind of blows my mind. Like, it's like a bird call where every single species of cricket that does this has their own distinct call, which makes sense because, if you're a male calling out to a female, you definitely want to attract your own species, not just all the crickets in the area. So that makes a lot of sense, right? You want to bring the females of your own species to you. But it blows my mind. By the way, this phenomenon of an insect making a sound like this is called stridulation, which basically means two body parts rubbing together to make a sound. And so in the case of crickets, it's usually their wings. So they have like a Velcro-like hooked structure on their hind wings that they rub together to make that sound. In some others, it's their legs that they will rub together, their hind legs that they'll rub together. But yeah, it's typically their wings that they'll rub together to make this call. So yeah, out of the thousands of species in this order, every one of them has a different call, which is super cool, super interesting. And then this third family that I wanted to talk about, Gryllotalpidae, the mole crickets, are very cool. I made a whole bug of the week a while ago about these guys. It's a short video, but I just want to talk about them again here. The Gryllotalpidae are very cool because they're a larger cricket, I would say. Usually 2 to 3 inches long, and their front legs are modified for digging. These are called fossorial legs. And they're called the mole cricket because their front legs look a lot like the front legs of a mole. And they use them for the same reason. They use them to dig around in the dirt. And they're very, very good at this. They're very good at digging in the dirt. So I've never actually collected one of these. I know people who have, but they're difficult to find because, well, number one, they're always underground. And number two is if you do find them, they're super, super fast. Like, they'll run away and dig down really, really quickly. But if you're ever looking for them, you can often find them after like a heavy rainstorm or flooding. They'll come up out of the ground to avoid being drowned. And so, if you're looking for one, wait for like a big rainstorm or flooding, and maybe you'll find one. Click up here if you want to learn more about their history coming to the U.S., because they're actually invasive to the U.S. But yeah, I talk about that in that Bug of the Week video. So another interesting thing about their acoustic call is what we've been talking about throughout this series is there are typically things that will exploit a system. And basically, I would say if there is like a behavior or a relationship that happens in nature, there's usually someone that will exploit it, or a cheater. And so on some islands in Hawaii, there's actually an example of this. And this is a very interesting study system if you guys are interested in learning more about it. So look it up if you're interested. But there are these crickets in Hawaii. And what happened was a researcher noticed that these crickets had stopped doing their call. And so she was curious, like, why are all the crickets silent? Like, that's super unusual. And it's, out of all the places, why are they quiet on these islands in Hawaii? And so she started looking around, like, maybe it's just because the crickets went away. Like, maybe they got, Maybe there was some pressure that eliminated the crickets. And, well, that wasn't true. She found a bunch of crickets. They were still there. And so she looked at the specimens, and she found that those little structures that I talked about on their wings that they used to rub together were gone. Like, they had gone away, which was super weird and unusual. So she started wondering, well, why? Why did those structures go away in this population? So these parasitoid flies actually have tympanal organs similar to the crickets to pick up the same frequency that these crickets put out. And so these flies are invasive, and so these crickets don't have a natural, defense against them. These flies would basically catch the call of the male cricket, fly to where he is, lay their egg on him, and the egg would hatch, the larvae would eat through the cricket and kill it. And so what happened was these flies basically wiped out all the crickets, but there was one catch. This selective pressure was so high, but it didn't quite wipe out the crickets, right? Like I said, the crickets were still around. So what happened was there were some individuals who did not have the stridulation structure to begin with, and those ones survived. And so all of the males that were, stridulating, making this sound, were being killed by the fly. But the ones who weren't were able to survive and reproduce with the females, meaning the genes that facilitated the stridulation organs were selected against in the population. There was such a high selective pressure against the stridulation organ that the males without that organ prevailed and were able to mate. And now that population doesn't have that stridulation organ anymore. I just thought that was super cool, super interesting, and a cool example of, how such a high selective pressure can make something adapt so quickly. So you might be wondering, well, how did these silent males exist in the population to begin with? Well, this is an interesting thing too, because these silent males are also an example of an eavesdropper, a cheater in this system. So what would happen is the loud males would call. A female would come and be receptive and follow the sound of that male. But the silent males were also following the call of the male. So what the silent males would do is they would go to the call of the male and wait until the female came. And then before the loud male could see her, the silent male would sneak in and mate with her. It's crazy, but it was just clever enough to work, and it stayed in the population, and ultimately it saved these crickets because the flies came in, they killed all the loud males, and now the silent males are the prevailing population. So very cool case. I will actually leave a link to the paper for this in the description if you guys are interested. Here are some orthopterans. There they are. That green one on the end is a katydid. And then the rest, and then the one on the other end is a smaller other species of katydid. And then the rest in the middle are grasshoppers. Those two big, huge orange ones are called lubber grasshoppers, and they're super invasive. So that's not fun. But they're super invasive in Florida. And then on that green one, the big green one, you might be able to see it right under the abdomen. That's its ovipositor that I talked about. So this is a female. Anyways, guys, that's about it for this episode. I talked for a while. This might be one of the longer episodes out there because I think Orthoptera is so cool. They deserve a nice long video for you guys. Next week, we are talking about Mantophasmatodia, which is a very small, weird, obscure order that I didn't even know about until very recently. So if you don't want to miss it, definitely leave a like, subscribe so you don't miss that episode. Leave a comment if I forgot your favorite orthopteran that you want to tell us about. But with that, I will see you all next week. But until then, keep on bugging. Peace.